Alright, boys and girls, let's buckle up and get ready, because The Hill has got several brilliant videos highlighting shit that we need to talk about. Before we get into that, I want to talk about something serious. Anyone who's seen Talladega Nights is going to know what I'm talking about. So there's a scene toward the end of the movie, after Cal Naughton Jr. has taken Ricky Bobby's wife and his driving career away from him, and Ricky Bobby has lost everything. Now he claws his way back into NASCAR. And there's a scene where the owner wants Mr. Dennett wants Cal Naughton Jr. to take Ricky Bobby out of the race. Cal Naughton comes back over the radio and says, "You tell Mr. Dennett that Ricky Bobby is my best friend, and it's time for shake and bake." Damn the torpedoes! And then he goes up and he helps his buddy, gets in front of him, gives him the windbreak. Ricky Bobby engages the slingshot. Now the reason that I bring this up is because this is a situation that we, as Americans, can all relate to. We've got differences. Maybe some of us have banged each other's wives. But just like those two, we can overcome that and see the humanity and see the importance of love and forgiveness in our society. That's what's truly important. Not your idealistic views, not any of the bullshit that you're fighting about, race, gender, sexual orientation. We're all human beings first. And your best friend, even if he does bang your wife, does it out of love. Okay? Something like that. I don't know. You know, my message is convoluted and hard to understand, but the foundation is good. You know what I mean? Like, I mean well. Let's get into it.
Member countries of BRICS, a growing non-Western economic collective, are meeting for their 15th annual summit in South Africa this week with a big announcement. 5 new member countries have been added to the current bloc: Egypt, Ethiopia, Argentina.
Listen, I know that not everybody is going to be, like, even know what BRICS is, so let's get into that, okay? Brazil, India, China, Saudi Arabia, North Korea possibly, and there's some others that are applying. But this is an organization that is, did I say Russia? Yeah, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Saudi Arabia. This is a consortium of people that are coming together based on the weaponization of the US dollar, watching the sanctions against Russia most recently, but the sanctions have been used forever. And the reason they work is because we control the petrodollar. All oil is traded in the US dollar. We issue debt in our own currency. There's many things that are unique. We are the reserve currency at the moment. So other fake currencies back their fake currencies with our fake currency, which is backed by the strength of the US government. You know what I'm saying? That's all it is. It's just like, hey, I owe you, buddy. Like in, Dumb and Dumber, where he's like, that one's a Lamborghini. You're going to want to hang on to that one. Okay? You got IOUs in this whole thing. Every dollar is accounted for. Don't worry.
The UAE, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. They join current members Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Now, at the summit, leaders from member countries discussed de-dollarization, Western global hegemony, and moving toward a multipolar world.
In a thinly veiled statement, Chinese President Xi Jinping wrote, quote, "One country obsessed with maintaining its hegemony has gone out of its way to cripple the emerging markets in developing countries. Whoever is developing fast becomes its target of containment. Whoever is catching up becomes its target of obstruction. But this is futile. As I have said more than once, that blowing out others' lamp will not bring light to oneself." Joining us now to weigh in is editor at The Gray Zone, Max Blumenthal. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, this feels like a really significant global shift, and an end, as people are saying, to Western hegemony that many people predicted as we headed into this.
Listen, not everybody understands Chinese, so let me translate into sign language. Okay, this is what China's saying. Just like that. That's what they're saying. I don't know if everybody understands sign language, but that's the message.
Ukraine proxy war, China becoming more closely aligned with Russia, and this growth of this economic alliance that's meant to counterbalance Western hegemony and economic dominance seems to be really telling. Help us understand what's at stake here.
Well, this is the most historic gathering of the BRICS, which was founded in 2009 to democratize international trade and international institutions by fostering multipolarity, countering the bipolar, unipolar world that's emerged since the collapse of the Soviet Union, which has brought on disaster for the global South, as well as unchecked violations of international law through coalitions of the willing, as we've seen in Iraq and beyond. The BRICS aims to foster trade.
For everyone that's all upset and can't sleep about the Ukrainian war, someone made an excellent point, summarized it so beautifully, I couldn't even believe it. If you're worried about Ukraine, Russia attacking Ukraine, and you can't sleep at night, and America needs to go and defend them, I want you to picture that Ukraine is Palestine and the US is Russia. You know? Same thing.
Trade through a new development bank, as it's called, and this could potentially upend the hegemony, the domination of the dollar, particularly if states like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which provide the basis for the petrodollar, which is itself the foundation of dollar hegemony, if they join and begin trading in local currency. For example, Saudi Arabia is discussing trading or selling oil to China in renminbi, which would break the dominance of the petrodollar. So the reason this gathering is so historic is because BRICS is actually talking about expanding and has pledged to expand to some very significant countries, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But of course, expansion can bring a lot of political complication.
The U.S. has been trying to flex its influence all over the world for so long. We've spent so much money. We're spending so much money right now in Ukraine, the projects in the Middle East, the bases everywhere, on and on and on. Do you think the American people might feel at some point cheated by their government, that so much money of this money has been spent and you might say that was not a good idea to do this in the first place, but we did do it, and yet we did not. Our influence is in decline, despite how much effort and how many resources we've exhausted to remain, the top country, the top government in the world.
Well, our correspondent Anya Parampil is in Johannesburg covering the BRICS right now, and one thing she's noticed at a conference which mostly pertains to the nations of the global South, especially the non-aligned nations that didn't line up with the Soviet Union or the U.S. during the Cold War and which seek to fight for their independence, is the presence of many Americans as well as British reporters from places like The Economist. What are they doing there? Well, they sort of represent the interests of the G7, which is often posited as the dominant sphere of economic sphere, and they're threatened by what's happening at BRICS because of the prospect of de-dollarization, which is the dollar hegemony.
Listen, I'm pro-America, and I know that I'm smiling with this shit that's going on. It's not good for America, but you know what else isn't good for America? A lot of internal foreign policy that's driven people to the point, like, for example, right? If you work at a job, you're getting paid excellent, you're getting treated well. Are you out there looking for another job? No, the fuck you aren't, motherfucker. You are like, this is the shit. I come in, I hang out with my boss, he's got hilarious shit to say, he pays me good. I love it. You know what I mean? But if you're getting fucked, eventually you get tired of it. You're like, I think it's time to get the fuck out of here. So we make our own bed and we sleep in it. You know what I mean? The consequences are what's important. For the leadership to understand that they cannot behave with impunity and treat the rest of the world like complete shit. We can't just be assholes forever. You know what I mean? At some point, we need to come back to the table and be like, okay, we're going to be civil again. Just like it would be great if we could do that inside the country too, because not only are we being assholes foreign policy wise and treating the rest of the world like they're dog shit on the bottom of our boot to be scraped off and fucking thrown in the fire, but we seem to be treating citizen versus citizen. If you've got political views that don't align with this person's, that's the most important thing. And especially if it's family. Are you motherfuckers fucking high? In the old days, family first, blood's thicker than water. Now you got people that are abandoning their family. I know people that won't talk to their family members not talking with each other, and it's just purely based on who voted for who in 2016, 2020. We're becoming so ignorant, so polarized, so idealistic that we can't even recognize that the most important thing is to see each other as humans. Because the easiest way to go to war against another people is to dehumanize them. We do it every time that we go to war with anybody. In fact, everybody who's ever been to war pretty much does this. These people are evil, they're subhuman, they're ignorant, they can't be saved. And when you've got half of America saying that about the other half, and that other half is saying it right back, and that's where we're at, if you're not more concerned about that shit than your fucking stance on the war in Ukraine or your stance on any other bullshit social issues, you got your priorities drastically fucked up.
Is the basis for U.S. financial sanctions, which are administered unilaterally, not through the UN, to destroy the economies and the people of countries from Syria to Venezuela to Cuba to countries like Eritrea, which is kind of the Cuba of Africa and has resisted IMF loans, taken its own line. And what the U.S. has done by actually sanctioning 1/3 of the world's population, think about that, is created a backlash
Yeah,
where these countries
yeah.
are now gathering together and figuring
That
out
dude
how they
fucks.
can conduct trade and break away from the dollar. And you've heard that expressed in the president's roundtable today that was held and convened by UN General Secretary Antonio Guterres from Venezuela, for example, or from Eritrea, about the unfairness of global relations with the dollar dominating all trade and their desire to break it. They're not hiding their agenda right now. However, there are other nations like Brazil, which have feared expansion of the BRICS because they don't want to come to loggerheads with the US. And Brazil has only agreed to allow Argentina in at this point. But the desire is there, the possibilities are there, and the US is making it almost impossible for many of these countries to operate within the Bretton Woods system and not be financially immiserated.
So I think what's really important, if you want folks to really understand what's going on here, is to get at the root of what Xi Jinping was saying in the quote that we read at the top. This idea that this isn't conspiracy, this isn't just, our quote unquote enemy talking, but that it has been an explicit harshly inflicted policy of the United States of America to maintain global dominance by actively suppressing other countries as they grow and develop, either through sanctions, as you pointed out, with 1/3 of the world's people being sanctioned, or through other kind of economic tools like the IMF. But I do think sometimes we skip over how exactly something like the IMF, which many people understand is just a good thing that gives money to governments so that they can grow, and are we just being charitable? I mean, how do all of those global organizations, those financial organizations, act as a tool of the government in this way? And therefore, and how does that help us understand why this BRICS alliance and the growth of the BRICS alliance is so important to shaking off the shackles of U.S. control, economic control?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that's the point of the new development bank, is to give out loans that are favorable to countries who do not want to have to meet the political conditions that the United States and its transatlantic partners mete out and impose on them.
They haven't gotten into this yet, which I'm shocked. But part of the incentivization for this alternative to the dollar is the fact that we have locked Russia out of the global oil trade, because all oil is traded in the US dollar, and Russia is not allowed to possess or trade US dollars, all US dollars have been seized that we can find, unless they got cash in their mattress or something like that. So, they have no option. We have created this situation. And this is going to piss some people off too, but you know what? I don't care. We agreed at one point that NATO would not go past, I think Germany. I can look that up, but we agreed that it wouldn't go past a certain line. Okay, Gorbachev, let's see. Boom. Let's see what this says. Who promised what? Buttress. H.W. Bush assured Gorbachev during the Malta summit in December that the U.S. would not take advantage. I have not jumped up and down on the Berlin Wall of the revolutions in Eastern Europe to harm Soviet interests, but neither Bush nor Gorbachev at that point. Let's see. The changes in Eastern Europe and the German unification process not lead to an impairment of Soviet security interests. Therefore, NATO should rule out an expansion of its territory towards the east, i.e. moving closer to the Soviet borders. And this was Germany, so this is correct. This is source documentation, so saying we're not going to go east of Germany. And look where we're at now. So, you can not like it if you want, but the fact is that Russia was massing troops, and I can show you articles like Russia's massing troops before. Yeah, NBC News. So, I mean, they were on the border when these discussions were happening, clearly amassing huge amounts of troops on the border. And until we went forward with the NATO plan where we're like, they don't have the balls to do anything, we're just gonna bring them into the fold, and Putin's gonna just lay down like a dog. I don't think I don't think Russia would have invaded if we hadn't pushed the issue. If we'd said, listen, let's negotiate. You got troops on the border. We're talking about bringing Ukraine in. Let's just squash it before hundreds of thousands of people die. Because from what I read, at least 600,000 dead. About 250 to 300,000 on each side. Those are probably old numbers. Still a lot of dead people. And you've got people in America that are celebrating Putin being punished and the weakening of Russia. And they're just so clueless about what is truly going on. What's truly going on is we are strengthening the alliances of our most powerful enemies and accelerating, potentially, the end of our dominance as BRICS meets and figures out a gold-backed alternative to the US dollar, which moved off of gold a long time ago, which I believe that they moved off of gold because gold was going to be needed in such huge supply and quantity for manufacturing purposes that they could no longer use it as money, so they outlawed its use as money, currency, a token of exchange. You used to be able to turn in dollars and get gold if you wanted. It was all backed by gold. They took it all off because if that had continued, the price of fucking gold would be astronomical instead of largely stagnant for a very long time. And if you want to get into speculative investing, I'm not a financial advisor, but if this currency rolls out, there will be a huge demand for gold to back it, especially if they expand it, if it becomes popular and it needs more dollars in circulation. Um, the price of gold could go to the moon. So I have millions of tons of gold buried under my house under the foundation. Don't tell anybody. I'm going to be rich if that happens, though.
So we can look at what's happening in Argentina right now after years and years of austerity imposed by the IMF because their reserves are dried up and they're experiencing hyperinflation. The country's shifting right. And the front runner in their election is Javier Milei, who's a right-wing libertarian, which may actually complicate their BRICS membership.
Isn't it hilarious when financial problems arise, how people run to conservatives, financial conservatives, to fix things? Imagine that. Weird.
As well as Latin American cooperation. Or we can think of this in light of the Hunter Biden scandal and what the IMF, how the U.S. uses the IMF even against supposed allies. Joe Biden, when his son was on the Burisma board, went to Kiev and threatened them with an IMF loan, showing how the U.S. can control the IMF, and said, you will not receive this loan unless you, quote, reform your judiciary, fire the prosecutor, and do everything that might have been needed to protect Burisma from prosecution. So it actually fostered more corruption in Ukraine. And then once they got the loan, they had to meet all these austerity conditions, which have doomed the Ukrainian population, particularly Ukrainian workers, sold off their land. And so BRICS is presenting an alternative. And it's also politically significant that Russia and China are able to break through the attempts to isolate them, or in Joe Biden's words, reduce the ruble to rubble. Vladimir Putin, in his address to BRICS, pledged to actually supplant Ukraine as a global grain supplier to Africa and promised tons and tons of free grain to Africa. Africa has experienced the brunt of the Ukraine proxy war and U.S. sanctions and complications of grain exports. And so this is massive for Africa. And then we can look at what's happening inside Africa in the Sahel region, where you have these popular coups overthrowing governments that had been tools of the West, particularly Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, particularly tools of France. And Niger is following on the foothills of this multipolar development by starting a new company to not just export tomatoes and then import tomato paste, but to actually produce tomato-based products and to industrialize their gold production, which right now consists of a lot of youth in informal artisanal mines holding out pans in water. This is a massive development that will have a ricochet effect throughout the African continent.
Yeah, that's such an important point. I just did a deep dive on Niger on my own podcast recently.
By the way, all your fancy electronics, a lot of them, the precious metals inside, are being mined by children in Africa. So go buy the iPhone 15 when it, releases, because you want to keep the children in the mines, right?
I was really shocked by an expert who was explaining the extent to which all of those countries in the so-called post-colonial era were very much still subject to control by France through their currency, and have been victims of a highly extractive relationship with France throughout, and have had intentionally their infrastructure and their development thwarted, while China's approach has been to build stadiums and infrastructure, and that's part of why it's been so dominant. One last question that I had for you, though, is the American public, since the end of the Cold War, has been convinced that America's efforts to maintain global dominance are in the interest of the American people. There was the domino theory and the broad public investment in the idea that you had to beat the Soviets, got to beat them to the moon, you got to beat them around the world. It justified any number of wars, Vietnam, et cetera, stopping the expansion of communism. Is something changing now, or are we still in a situation where the idea of other global powers emerging, namely China, is being used by people to beat the drum of war? And if that's the case, how should Americans think about the decline of American dominance globally? Are they wrong to think that it will negatively impact their standards of living? And why should they think differently about perhaps a kind of global solidarity?
I'll tell you, you should be fucking afraid, because the easiest way to control you is through fear. So the government is going to sound the alarm bells, say it's a crisis, and before you have time to process what's going on, they're going to say, we need to go to even more war. We're already at war. By the way, Congress is the only body that can declare war, and that hasn't been done since World War II. So all these wars are fucking illegal, including the bullshit we're doing in Ukraine. That's not sanctioned by Congress. This is all done just, well, it's not a war, it's a battle. It's an engagement. Fucking do all kinds of mental gymnastics to get out of the idea that it's fucking war. And you know what? Also, if you don't believe me about the child minds, this is a question. This is a statement. Here's a picture. Does that make you feel good? Oh, look. Apple and Google named in U.S. lawsuit over Congolese child cobalt mining deaths. Look at this. That's a child. That's a child carrying cobalt on the back of their neck. Artisanal mines.
Well, we're looking at the decline of American hegemony, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the US is experiencing an economic decline. Our economy is completely financialized and based on artificially backed currency. But the US has the means to do what other countries are doing to fuel its own development if it actually sought to do it, if it wasn't selling off its industrial base at the whims of corporations. But that's just not the reality that we've been living in. And I just think many Americans, and actually most Americans now, oppose aid to Ukraine. They don't accept this argument that sending aid there is actually beneficial to Americans in any way because they experienced what Biden falsely called the Putin price hike, which was actually the NATO price hike. By electing to sanction Russia, the US was no longer able to offset the oil that it refused to import from Iran and Venezuela and other oil producers because of political sanctions on those countries. So Americans need to understand how their government sanctions have a boomerang effect at home. They are not going to experience it as strongly as Europeans or Africans for that matter, but they're beginning to get the picture, and we see it even playing out in the Republican debates. Vivek Ramaswamy, who's just basically a proxy for Trump on so many positions, he successfully exposed the gulf between the Republican corporate elite and the Republican base on Ukraine, which understands that this war, it doesn't benefit it, and used it to break through in the debate while the rest of the candidates took the George W. Bush position, which has been discredited. There's no candidate putting forward that line within the Democratic Party, but it will be exposed further throughout this campaign that Americans understand they.
Is this is a guy that knows what's going on? RFK is against the Ukrainian war. He understands that this is not, but of course, let's just ignore him because he's not a real Democrat, right? He's being accused. He's a traditional liberal Democrat, traditional, and he's being accused of being right wing. It's a Kennedy. They're blue bloods, like for real. They've been in politics forever. Um, and the Putin tax, the Putin price hike, I can show you why that's bullshit. Who blew up the Nord Stream pipeline? Um, is this something that the U.S. didn't know? Who do you think was involved in this? Do you think Biden wasn't read into this? I mean, if it was a genuine terror attack, let's say Russia did it, we'd be indignant. We'd be like, oh, they cut us off. We did this. We didn't trust that Europe wouldn't become desperate and override the sanctions. So I believe that we destroyed the pipeline in order to sever the connection. Full commitment to the cause. If anyone else did this, it would be a big deal. Questions have been asked. No answers forthcoming. Everybody just kind of ignoring it. None of the three separate investigations carried by Germany, Sweden, and Denmark publicly assigned responsibility for the damage as of February 2023. Russia wanted to be involved in the investigation. Russia reportedly dispatched naval vessels to join Swedish and Danish maritime experts at the leak sites. Speculation of involvement of Russia, United States, Ukraine, other countries, the Royal Navy of sabotaging the gas pipeline. Yeah, so Putin price hikes more like the Biden price hikes because we're cutting our own nose off to spite our face.
They don't benefit from this so-called rules-based order in which the U.S. seeks to make the rules and everybody else has to follow its orders. Americans would like to have friendly trade relations too to benefit their economic future.
Yeah. My Ramaswamy's break with the rest of the candidates on the Ukraine issue is something I talked about on my radar, which viewers should check out if they missed it. Thank you, Max, so much for joining us.
Thanks, and check out the...
He's also the only one, when they asked what he would do for most things, including pardoning Trump, he didn't look left or right to see who was raising his hand. He raised his hand. Now, I'm not saying that he's not some sort of plant, because he is being allowed to say some very crazy things that most people would not be allowed to say. So that tells me that he's got some endorsements by people behind the scenes. I don't know who. I'm not behind the closed door meetings, but I can tell you this. When you see a system that appears to at first only be prosecuting Trump and no one else, like there's only one person in the government who's done anything corrupt that needs to be investigated, you start to realize that more than likely the guy that's being prosecuted is outside the system, everybody else is cooperating on the right and the left, and it's all just a big BS game. It's called the Uniparty, and it runs off of money. Billionaire donors funding campaigns. Red and blue, just colors. Republican, Democrat, just words. It's the party of money. That's the only way that you can get elected. It's the only way that you can run a campaign. It's the only way that you get into these positions. You get vetted and compromised, and you're allowed to move up the ladder if you play ball. Which is why Trump going and bypassing the whole line pissed off the system, and it pissed off the people who'd been patiently waiting in line and being a good boy, being a team player, and Trump just is like, no, this is all bullshit, this is all corrupt, da 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 da. Very polarizing, in my opinion, very true. And I think that the Biden investigation is just a sham, because they're realizing they've reached a crisis boiling point where people are like, what the fuck is going on? You are prosecuting a president when we know that there's plenty of other corruption. No one else has been prosecuted. No indictments, no charges, no nothing. Just one guy. You know, how much more fucking obvious can you make it? I would love for a candidate like RFK to be given a real chance, because as much as I think Trump did a good job, Trump is very polarizing, and it's going to be difficult. Even if he wants what's best for the country, it's difficult for people to believe that and not lose their minds and turn into psychos because they hate Trump with an irrational fervor that they just cannot get past. They cannot use their brain as long as, Donald Trump is sitting in office. They're just blind rage. All they see is just red. I mean, there were 4 peace deals in the Middle East inked in 4 months. It was like Israel and Bahrain, Israel and Saudi Arabia, Israel and, let's see, it's called the Abraham Accords. Um, all right. Well, kill me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Israel, Bahrain, Israel, Saudi Arabia, um, man, Israel and Morocco is the fourth country. Okay, the others were UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan, right here. Except. So you've got Morocco becomes the fourth country in the past 4 months to establish diplomatic relations with Israel. The others were UAE, Bahrain, and Sudan. All four deals were engineered by the U.S. Trump had promised a peace deal 4 years ago. 3 months ago, he delivered it just before the U.S. election as the UAE and Bahrain established diplomatic ties with Israel. It was a seismic shift in West Asian politics. The deal was called the Abraham Accords. So even this was considered, like F you. No Nobel Prize, no accolades, just more dog shit, more Trump being evil. All right, with that said, I know that I think I might have said at the beginning we had four, but this is, we're running a little bit long, so we're just going to chop her. And I know that that makes me a liar, but I'm the captain now. This is my ship. And if I say that we're going to just move swiftly along, well, I might have a mutiny on my hands, but I'm going to take that chance. All right? So, if you guys aren't extremely pissed off, come check me out in the next one. I love you. Take care. Thanks for sticking around.